The Resonance Matrix Volume 3 Episode 1 Stillness, After the Nervous System Lets Go. Hello, and welcome to the Resonance Matrix, a mirror linguistic hypothesis series, Volume 3 The Silencing Field, Return to Self. There is a moment that arrives after prolonged pressure lifts, though it rarely announces itself clearly. It does not arrive as relief or insight or gratitude. It arrives as something quieter and more difficult to interpret. A pause, a slowing, a subtle sense that the system is no longer being asked to respond. This moment often goes unrecognized because we are taught to look for movement as proof of recovery, forward motion, energy, clarity. But stillness does not look like progress. It does not feel productive. And after a long period of adaptation, it can even feel unsettling, like something essential has gone missing. This episode begins there, not at the point of healing, not at the point of action, but at the moment when the nervous system stops bracing. Volume 2 traced the architecture of influence, the ways language, pressure, reward, threat, and relational control override internal reference and replace it with an external signal. Across those episodes, the body learned to move for survival, to speak carefully, to comply strategically, to react quickly, to stay alert even in calm, to remain available even when depleted. Extortion was the final word of that descent for a reason. It is the moment when the body no longer negotiates, no longer adapts creatively, no longer bargains. It freezes. It submits not because it agrees, but because there are no viable alternatives left. It is not a weakness. It is biology doing the only thing it can to survive. Stillness does not arrive during that freeze. It arrives after the pressure ends, after the threat dissipates, after the environment no longer demands constant calibration. Because of that, stillness can feel strangely unsafe. When the nervous system has been trained to survive through movement, emotional movement, cognitive movement, and relational movement, the absence of demand can feel like a loss of purpose. The mind may look for the next problem. The body may feel heavy. The breath may deepen in a way that feels unfamiliar rather than comforting. This is not a collapse. This is cessation. Stillness is what happens when movement is no longer required for protection. Volume 3 begins here because nothing else can return until this moment is allowed. Sensation cannot be trusted until stillness stabilizes. Orientation cannot form while the nervous system is still scanning. Discernment cannot emerge when urgency is intact. Stillness is not rest. It is not calm. It is not peace. It is the biological recognition that the threat has ended. For many people, that recognition is delayed. The environment may be safe before the body believes it. The circumstances may change while the nervous system continues to operate on old data. This lag is not pathological. It is memory encoded in tissue, breath, posture, and reflex. Language played a role in that encoding. Words shaped expectation. Tone trained anticipation. Repetition rewired thresholds. But language also recedes here. Stillness is the first state where meaning does not need to be negotiated. This is important. In environments of influence, language is constant. It instructs, reframes, reassures, pressures, rewards, and corrects. It keeps the system oriented outward. Stillness is what happens when that external linguistic field quiets enough for the internal signal to re-emerge, not as insight, but as absence of demand. The absence can feel empty at first. People often report a strange flatness after leaving high-pressure systems or relationships. They expect relief and instead feel numb or neutral. They expect clarity and instead feel quiet. They expect energy and instead feel still. This is often misinterpreted as depression or loss of motivation, but biologically, it is something else entirely. It is the nervous system downshifting after prolonged mobilization. It is the moment when vigilance no longer has a target. The nervous system does not yet know what to do with this. Stillness is not yet safety. It is the absence of an immediate threat. The body must learn that difference slowly. This is why this episode does not ask you to do anything. It does not ask you to reflect deeply or take action. It does not frame stillness as an achievement or a goal. It simply names it as the first sign that the override has ended. Stillness is the first signal of return. Return not to who you were before, because that nervous system was shaped by earlier adaptations too, but return to the capacity to sense without bracing. The mirror linguistic framework has always pointed toward this moment, not toward decoding forever, but toward restoring the conditions in which decoding is no longer necessary. When the field no longer edits you in real time, the body stops needing to protect itself from meaning. Stillness is what happens when the nervous system is no longer being edited. It can feel unfamiliar because adaptation was familiar. Hypervigilance had rhythm. Anticipation had structure. Reaction provided momentum. Stillness removes that scaffolding. For a while, there may be nothing to replace it. That is not failure. It is a transition. Stillness is the thaw before sensation, the pause before orientation, the quiet before the signal returns. If you notice discomfort here, restlessness, impatience, the urge to move on, that urge itself is learned movement. It does not need to be resisted or followed. It only needs to be recognized. Volume 3 is not about ascending. It is not about becoming better. It is not about fixing what was broken. It is about allowing what was overridden to come back online in its own order. Stillness comes first because the body must stop reacting before it can start listening. If you are here and nothing seems to be happening yet, that is not a problem. That is the point of entry. That is the nervous system saying, quietly and without performance, that it no longer needs to protect itself through motion. This episode stays with that moment, not to analyze it, not to interpret it, but to give it enough space to be recognized for what it is. A return of signal does not begin with sensation. It begins when the noise finally stops. When the body stops anticipating stillness does not announce itself as safety. It announces itself as the absence of urgency. This distinction matters because the nervous system does not immediately trust quiet. After long periods of pressure, silence can feel suspicious. The body, accustomed to anticipating demand, continues scanning even when there is nothing left to scan for. Muscles remain lightly engaged. Attention drifts outward reflexively. The breath may slow, then subtly catch, as if waiting for the next instruction. This is not anxiety in the conventional sense. It is momentum without direction. For much of modern life, and especially for anyone who has lived inside systems of influence, coercion, performance, or prolonged relational strain, movement becomes synonymous with safety. Not physical movement alone, but internal movement, thinking ahead, adjusting tone, preparing responses, managing impressions, predicting reactions. The body learns that stillness is risky because it removes the buffer that movement provides. When movement stops protecting you, the nervous system does not immediately relax. It hesitates. This hesitation is the landscape of this section. Stillness is not the same as rest because rest implies permission. Stillness arrives before permission is granted. It is the system pausing not because it feels safe, but because it no longer has a reason to continue. Many people misinterpret this pause as a collapse. They describe feeling flat, unmotivated, detached, or strangely neutral. They worry something is wrong because they are no longer striving, fixing, proving, or reacting. But biologically, what is happening is far more precise. The nervous system is recalibrating its baseline. During prolonged periods of adaptation, the baseline shifts upward. Vigilance becomes normal. Alertness becomes identity. Readiness becomes personality. Over time, this elevated state feels like me. When the pressure that required it disappears, the system does not immediately return to a lower baseline. It overshoots into stillness first. This overshoot is protective. If the nervous system were to drop straight into sensation, it would be overwhelmed. Sensation carries information. Information requires interpretation. Interpretation requires reference. Stillness creates the buffer that allows reference to reform. This is why Volume 3 begins here, not because stillness is the goal, but because it is the prerequisite. Stillness is the moment when the nervous system stops rehearsing futures that are no longer coming. This can feel disorienting because rehearsal provided structure. Even painful anticipation had shape. The mind knew what it was preparing for. When that preparation ends, there is a temporary loss of narrative continuity. Time feels different. Space feels wider. Days may blur slightly. Attention may drift without attaching. None of this is dysfunction. It is the system unhooking from demand. Within the logic of the mirror linguistic framework, this is the first moment where language loosens its grip. Not because words disappear, but because words are no longer required to mediate safety. There is no immediate need to explain, justify, or frame experience. Meaning pauses. This pause can feel empty because we are conditioned to equate meaning with activity. But biologically, meaning is downstream from sensation, and sensation cannot return until stillness stabilizes. The nervous system needs proof, repeated, unremarkable proof, that nothing happens when it stops moving, that silence does not invite punishment, that pause does not result in loss, that nothing needs to be earned in the absence of effort. This proof is not conceptual, it is experiential, and it takes time. In this phase, the body may still orient outward reflexively. Sounds may register sharply. The nervous system may startle easily, not because it is afraid, but because it is recalibrating thresholds. Sleep patterns may shift. Dreams may become vivid or strangely mundane. Appetite may fluctuate. Energy may feel uneven. These are not signs of instability. They are signs of reorganization. Stillness is not passive. It is metabolically active. The brain is updating predictive models. The nervous system is testing new assumptions. What happens if I don't respond? What happens if I don't prepare? What happens if I don't adjust myself preemptively? Each time the answer is nothing, the system learns. This learning is slow because it contradicts previous conditioning. In environments of control, silence was rarely neutral. It was interpreted, judged, or filled by others. Stillness was read as withdrawal, defiance, or failure. The body learned that stillness carried consequences. Volume 2 mapped those consequences in detail. Volume 3 does not negate them. It works with the residue they left behind. This is why stillness can feel exposed. Without movement, there is nothing to hide behind. No performance, no calibration, no anticipatory compliance. The system is simply present. Presence without defense is unfamiliar at first, and unfamiliarity can be mistaken for danger. This is where many people rush prematurely into action. They label stillness as stagnation and push themselves back into motion. They seek stimulation, productivity, meaning, or connection to avoid the discomfort of unstructured quiet. But when stillness is interrupted too early, sensation returns distorted. Orientation forms around urgency. Discernment becomes reactive. The old patterns slip back in under a new name. Stillness must be allowed to complete its cycle. Completion here does not mean resolution. It means stabilization. The nervous system needs enough still moments to register a pattern. Nothing bad happens when I am not moving. Only then can sensation begin to surface without triggering alarm. Stillness is therefore not an endpoint. It is a clearing of residual pressure, a clearing of learned urgency, a clearing of reflexive self-monitoring. This is why this episode does not ask you to cultivate stillness or perform it correctly. That would turn it into another task. Stillness cannot be achieved through effort. It emerges when effort is no longer required. You may notice moments of stillness arriving spontaneously in the shower, while looking out of a window, during a pause in conversation, in the space between waking and thought. These moments are often brief at first. The system touches stillness, then pulls away. That pull away is not a failure, it is a caution. The nervous system is checking whether stillness is safe. Over time, as those moments repeat without consequence, stillness lasts longer. It becomes less charged. It begins to feel neutral rather than empty. Neutrality is a significant milestone. Neutrality means the system is no longer assigning threat or reward to the absence of movement. From there, sensation can begin to return. But not yet. This section ends where it needs to end, in the recognition that nothing needs to be done in order for stillness to do its work. Stillness is not something you hold. It is something that holds you briefly, quietly, while the nervous system relearns what it is like to exist without anticipation. In the next section, we will move closer to the moment when sensation begins to reappear, not as intensity, but as a signal. No lists, no instruction, no premature neuroscience deep dive, just a definition of stabilization. The etymology and definition of stillness. When movement no longer organizes meaning. Before stillness became a spiritual ideal, it was a physical condition. Before it was romanticized as peace or enlightenment, it was simply the absence of motion. The word itself carries no promise of insight, no guarantee of calm, no moral virtue. Those meanings were layered onto it later, often by cultures that misunderstood its function. To return to stillness accurately, we have to remove those layers. The word stillness comes from Old English still, meaning quiet, motionless, calm, or inactive, but crucially, not dead. The root implies a temporary pause, rather than an end state, something that has stopped moving, but has not ceased to exist, something present without exertion. This matters. Stillness is not collapse. It is not emptiness. It is not dissociation. It is a suspension. Historically, stillness was understood as a condition that allowed perception to reset. In agrarian societies, stillness was seasonal, a wintering of activity rather than a moral stance. In early contemplative traditions, stillness was preparatory, not terminal. It was the condition required before clarity could arise, not the clarity itself. Only later did stillness become conflated with virtue. In modern contexts, stillness is often framed as something to be cultivated, achieved, or performed correctly. This framing misunderstands its biological role. Stillness is not something the nervous system does intentionally. It is something that occurs when the nervous system no longer needs to mobilize. From the perspective of the body, stillness is diagnostic. It indicates that the threat has dropped below a threshold. It signals that vigilance is no longer required to maintain integrity. It marks the end of continuous adjustment. This is why stillness often arrives without warning, and why it can feel disorienting. In environments shaped by pressure, urgency, or influence, movement becomes compulsory. Not always visible movement, but internal movement. Monitoring, preparing, recalibrating, self-editing. Over time, this movement becomes so familiar that its absence feels like the absence of self. When that movement stops, the question that arises is not who am I now, but why am I not doing anything? That question is a learned reflex. Stillness exposes it. Within the resonance matrix framework, stillness is defined not as rest or calm, but as the first state in which the nervous system ceases to organize itself around external demand. This definition is intentionally narrow. Stillness does not mean safety has fully returned. It does not mean trust has been restored. It does not mean sensation is online. It simply means the nervous system is no longer being pulled. In Volume 2, language functioned as a force. Words shaped behavior, edited perception, and drove physiological response. Even silence carried meaning because it existed inside a field of pressure. Stillness marks the moment when that field loosens enough for silence to lose its charge. Silence and stillness are not the same. Silence is acoustic. Stillness is autonomic. You can be silent and still bracing. You can be moving and still internally still. Stillness is the cessation of preparatory tension. This is why people emerging from coercive or high-pressure environments often struggle to name what they are experiencing. They are no longer in danger, but they are not yet oriented. They are not depressed, but they are not energized. They are not numb, but they are not expressive. They are still. Modern psychology often lacks language for this state because it is not pathological. It is transitional. It does not fit neatly into diagnostic categories because it is not a disorder of function. It is a recalibration of the baseline. From a field perspective, stillness is the moment when the individual is no longer entrained to an external frequency, but has not yet re-established an internal one. There is no rhythm yet, no tempo, no directive, and without a directive, the mind may try to manufacture meaning prematurely. This is where stillness is often interrupted. The cultural discomfort with stillness is profound. We are trained to interpret inactivity as laziness, disengagement, or failure. Even recovery is expected to look productive. Stillness violates these expectations because it produces nothing observable. It is not expressive. It is not communicative. It does not reassure others. It simply exists. Biologically, this existence is expensive at first. The nervous system has to tolerate uncertainty without movement. It has to resist the urge to orient toward imagined futures. It has to remain present without a task. This tolerance is not learned through effort. It is learned through exposure. Repeated experiences of stillness without consequence teach the system something critical. Nothing bad happens when I stop. This learning cannot be rushed. Stillness is therefore not a practice to be optimized. It is a condition to be allowed. In earlier phases of influence, stillness was often unsafe. Pausing meant losing ground. Hesitation meant vulnerability. Silence invited interpretation. The system learned to stay active to avoid being overwritten. Now in the return arc, stillness is reclaimed, not as defiance, but as neutrality. Neutrality is the key here. Stillness is not peace because peace implies resolution. Stillness does not resolve. It suspends. It creates the space in which resolution might later occur, but it does not force it. This is why stillness must come before sensation. Sensation carries information. Information invites interpretation. Interpretation requires reference. Without stillness, reference is unstable. Sensation becomes noise or threat. Stillness stabilizes the ground. Only then can the body begin to speak again. This section names stillness accurately, so that it is not mistaken for something it is not. It is not regression. It is not avoidance. It is not emptiness. It is the nervous system standing down from a posture it no longer needs. That standing down can feel anticlimactic. After so much effort to survive, stillness can feel undeserved or pointless. But biology does not care about narrative satisfaction. It cares about recalibration. Stillness is recalibration without instruction. As we move forward in this volume, stillness will recede naturally. Sensation will begin to return. Orientation will follow. Discernment will emerge slowly, not as judgment, but as clarity. But none of that can happen while the system is still preparing for impact. This episode does not try to make stillness meaningful. It allows it to be sufficient. In the next section, we will stay close to the moment when stillness begins to shift, not into action, but into the faint reappearance of an internal signal. For now, stillness has done its work simply by being named. The body has stopped moving because it no longer has to. The cognitive shift, when urgency dissolves one of the most unsettling aspects of stillness, is not what it contains, but what it removes. Urgency disappears, and for many people, urgency has been organizing their inner life for so long that its absence feels like a malfunction. This is where confusion often enters, not because anything has gone wrong, but because something familiar has stopped happening. The nervous system is no longer pushing. The mind is no longer racing ahead. There is no immediate problem to solve, no demand to meet, no threat to manage, no reward to chase. And without those signals, the mind often asks a quiet but alarming question. What am I supposed to do now? This question does not come from curiosity. It comes from conditioning. Urgency is rarely recognized for what it actually is, a learned survival reflex. Over time, it becomes so embedded in identity that it feels like motivation, purpose, or drive. But biologically, urgency is a state of readiness, the system preparing itself for impact, correction, or extraction. In Volume 2, urgency was not incidental. It was engineered. Provocation accelerated it. Seduction softened resistance so urgency could be bypassed. Gaslighting destabilized reference, so urgency replaced clarity. Bribery rewarded compliance, so urgency narrowed. Coercion compressed choice until urgency became funneled, and extortion froze the system when urgency could no longer move. By the end of that descent, urgency was no longer optional. It was compulsory. So when stillness arrives, when urgency is no longer required, the mind does not interpret this as relief. It interprets it as a loss of function. This is why stillness often feels uncomfortable, wrong, or even dangerous at first. The absence of urgency is misread as emptiness because urgency once kept the system alive. That line matters enough to sit with. Urgency did not feel good, but it worked. It worked because it kept you moving. It worked because it prevented collapse. It worked because it gave the mind something to hold. It worked because it substituted activity for safety. When urgency dissolves, those functions disappear all at once. What replaces them is not immediately pleasure or peace. What replaces them is exposure. Without urgency, the mind no longer has a task to hide behind. This is where boredom, restlessness, and subtle anxiety begin to appear, not as symptoms to be fixed, but as transitional states. Boredom is often misunderstood as a lack of interest or lack of stimulation. In this context, boredom is the mind discovering that its usual drivers are gone. It is not asking for entertainment. It is asking for orientation. Restlessness is not impatience. It is momentum without direction. The nervous system still expects to move, but there is nowhere it needs to go. Anxiety in quiet is not fear of silence. It is the nervous system checking whether silence is safe, because in the past, silence often preceded consequences. None of these states indicates pathology. They indicate withdrawal from urgency. This is why many people rush to fill stillness with productivity, insight-seeking, or self-improvement. They turn it into a project. They look for meaning, lessons, next steps, or explanations. They restart movement cognitively even when the body has stopped. This restart feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels like doing the work. But often it is avoidance. Not avoidance of truth, avoidance of sensation that has not yet returned safely. Urgency keeps sensation at bay. Movement suppresses feeling. Insight delays contact. When urgency dissolves, sensation will eventually come back online, but not yet. And the mind, accustomed to staying ahead of feeling, tries to restart urgency to maintain control. This is not failure, it is a habit. The cognitive shift in this section is about recognizing urgency for what it actually was, not purpose, not drive, not clarity, but protection. Protection from overwhelm, protection from helplessness, protection from loss of control. When that protection is no longer required, the mind panics slightly, not because something bad is happening, but because something familiar has stopped. Stillness reveals how much of life was being organized around next. Next task, next response, next improvement, next explanation. Without next, the mind has nothing to grip. This is why people often describe this phase as floating, drifting, or suspended. Time can feel strange. Days may lose sharpness. Productivity metrics stop applying. Motivation becomes inconsistent. But what is actually happening is simpler than it feels. The nervous system is no longer being pulled forward. This forward pull urgency was the primary organizer of attention. Remove it, and attention no longer knows where to go. That does not mean attention is broken. It means it is free for the first time. Freedom, however, is not immediately comfortable when the nervous system has never experienced it without threat. This is where Volume 3 makes a critical distinction. This arc is not about replacing urgency with calm, or fear with confidence, or control with surrender. It is about letting urgency dissolve before anything else is asked to take its place. If urgency is replaced too quickly by spiritual meaning, self-concept, productivity, or identity, the nervous system never learns that it can exist without being driven. Stillness must be allowed to feel unproductive. It must be allowed to feel empty. It must be allowed to feel awkward. These feelings are not problems. They are evidence that the old organizing principle is no longer in control. This section does not ask you to like stillness. It asks you not to misinterpret it. Boredom is not failure. Restlessness is not regression. Quiet anxiety is not a danger. They are signs that urgency has lost its grip, and that loss is the first true return of agency, even though it does not feel like power yet. Power comes later. For now, the nervous system is learning something far more fundamental, that it does not need to move to survive, that it does not need to respond to exist, that nothing terrible happens when urgency dissolves. This learning happens slowly, beneath thought. The mind will try to restart the movement many times. That is expected. But each time urgency fades again without consequence, the nervous system updates its expectations, and that update is what makes the next phase possible. Stillness does not give answers. It removes the pressure to ask the wrong questions. In the next section, we will move closer to the moment when the body begins to register again, not as emotion, not as insight, but as the faint re-emergence of sensation, the somatic blueprint thawing without movement. Stillness is often mistaken for inactivity because we are taught to equate movement with life. But biologically, stillness is one of the most active states the nervous system can enter, not because it is doing something, but because it is stopping doing what it no longer needs. What unfolds here is not rest and not collapse. It is thaw. The body does not thaw through effort. It thaws through permission. During prolonged exposure to pressure, threat, coercion, or influence, the nervous system organizes itself around protection. Muscles hold tone even when no movement is required. Breath becomes economical rather than expansive. The jaw tightens slightly. The shoulders hover just above relaxation. The spine maintains readiness. None of this is conscious. It is the body maintaining an exit strategy. Stillness is the first moment that exit strategy is no longer required. This does not happen all at once. It happens in fragments. A muscle releases without instruction. The breath deepens, then pauses. A sigh escapes before it is noticed. A subtle tremor ripples through the limbs and fades. These are not symptoms. They are signatures. The nervous system is renegotiating its relationship with safety. From a physiological perspective, this phase represents parasympathetic re-entry, not as forced calm, but as spontaneous downshifting. The sympathetic charge that once organized action begins to lose dominance. The body does not immediately relax in the way people imagine relaxation. Instead, it unhooks from sustained readiness. This is why stillness can feel unfamiliar rather than soothing. Guarding has become the norm. When guarding dissolves, the body must relearn its own weight. Muscular unguarding often arrives asymmetrically. One side of the body may soften before the other. The jaw may release while the shoulders remain lifted. The legs may feel heavy while the chest stays alert. This uneven thaw is not an imbalance, it is sequencing. The nervous system does not trust all regions equally. Areas that were most involved in protection thaw last. Breath is one of the earliest indicators that something has changed, not because breathing is controlled, but because it reflects autonomic state instantly. When vigilance is high, breath is shallow, paced, restrained. When vigilance loosens, breath deepens on its own. There is often a moment where the inhale lengthens unexpectedly, followed by a pause that feels almost too long. This pause can feel alarming if the system is not used to it. The mind may rush in to restart breathing consciously. That rush is a habit. If allowed, the pause resolves itself. The body remembers how to breathe when it is not being watched. Subtle tremors are another common feature of this phase. They are often misinterpreted as anxiety or weakness, but they are neither. Tremors are a discharge, small releases of residual tension stored during immobilization or prolonged readiness. Animals do this instinctively. Humans often suppress it because it looks uncontrolled. In stillness, the body reclaims this mechanism. The tremor passes, Nothing bad happens. The system learns something important. Freeze can resolve without action. This is a critical biological insight. Freeze is often misunderstood as paralysis or shutdown. But freeze is not the absence of movement. It is the containment of movement. The nervous system is holding energy in suspension, waiting for conditions to change. Stillness is what allows that energy to disperse safely. This is why stillness must come before sensation. Sensation carries a charge. Without thaw, sensation overwhelms. Stillness creates the conditions where sensation can return without triggering alarm. From a resonance matrix perspective, this is the inverse of override. Override forced the body to act against its own timing. Thaw restores timing without instruction. This is not healing as achievement. It is a regulation as an allowance. Culturally, stillness has often been misunderstood or distorted. In productivity-driven societies, stillness is treated as laziness or lack of ambition. In spiritual traditions, it is sometimes elevated into an ideal, a state to be attained, performed, or maintained. Both interpretations miss the point. Stillness is not a value. It is a phase. In contemplative traditions, stillness was never meant to be permanent. It was a threshold, a doorway between agitation and clarity. Zen called it just sitting. Taoist philosophy described it as returning to the uncarved block. Early monastic traditions saw stillness as the condition in which truth could surface, not the truth itself. In each case, stillness was not effortful. It was receptive. The body knew this long before the mind tried to define it. Philosophically, stillness challenges one of the deepest assumptions of modern identity, that agency requires action. In this phase, the agency appears as non-interference. The system chooses not to mobilize, not to explain, not to optimize. This choice is not conscious. It is biological consent. The nervous system is saying, I am allowed to be here without performing. That permission is revolutionary for bodies conditioned by control. Many people notice a subtle emotional neutrality during this phase. Not joy, not sadness, a kind of quiet flatness. This is often misread as numbness, but it is not dissociation. Dissociation removes sensation. Stillness suspends urgency. There is a difference. Numbness feels absent. Stillness feels present but unactivated. This distinction matters because it prevents premature self-judgment. The body is not failing to feel. It is choosing not to react. Autonomic recalibration takes time. The nervous system must sample stillness repeatedly before it trusts it. Each uneventful still moment becomes data. Each sigh without consequence becomes proof. Each pause without penalty becomes reassurance. This learning does not happen through insight. It happens through experience. The mirror linguistic hypothesis reminds us that language shapes neural expectation. During override, language constantly signaled demand, respond, comply, adapt, explain, perform. Stillness is the first state where language loses its regulatory role. Words recede, meaning pauses. The body takes precedence. This is why many people feel a strange quieting of internal dialogue during stillness, not clarity, but absence of chatter. The mind is not silenced by discipline. It simply has nothing it needs to manage. From a field perspective, this marks the moment when external entrainment loosens. The system is no longer synchronized to external tempo. It begins to operate on its own, slower rhythm. This rhythm is not yet expressive. It is preparatory. Stillness is the body learning that it does not need to act. That line holds everything in this section. Action was once necessary. Reaction was once protective. Movement was once survival. Stillness arrives when those conditions no longer apply. This does not mean danger will never return. It means danger is not present now. The nervous system is exquisitely contextual. It does not guarantee safety forever. It samples safety moment by moment. Stillness is the sample. As this phase stabilizes, the body's internal volume begins to adjust. Sensation will eventually become more noticeable. Orientation will follow. But stillness must not be rushed, because rushing recreates the very pattern that override depended on. Stillness teaches the system a new truth. I can exist without responding. That truth is the foundation of everything that comes next. Sensation will only be trustworthy if stillness comes first. Orientation will only be accurate if urgency is dissolved fully. Discernment will only be clean if the body is no longer bracing. This is why Volume 3 does not begin with empowerment or expression. It begins with permission. Stillness is not inactivity. It is nervous system consent. Once consent is restored at the biological level, the body can begin slowly, cautiously, honestly to speak again. As the body begins to thaw, there is often an expectation that something else should follow. A feeling, a memory, a release, a sense of relief that announces itself clearly enough to be recognized. But most of the time, that doesn't happen. Instead, there is a quieter transition, one that doesn't present as an experience so much as an absence. The absence of urgency, the absence of pressure, the absence of the need to respond. This is often where confusion arises, because culturally we are trained to associate healing with movement, insight, or emotional discharge. We expect something to occur, a breakthrough, a catharsis, a sense of better. But what the nervous system is doing here is far more subtle. It is recalibrating to a world where nothing is demanding it. The thaw does not immediately feel like sensation. It often feels like nothing is happening at all, and that nothingness is not emptiness. It is latency. It is the space that appears when survival has ended, but orientation has not yet returned. The body is no longer braced, but it has not yet learned what to do with the absence of threat. This is the moment where many people assume something has gone wrong. They look for improvement and find flatness. They look for clarity and find waiting. They look for direction and find stillness that doesn't explain itself. What is actually happening is not internal failure, but contextual transition, because the body does not thaw in isolation. It thaws inside a field, and once internal pressure releases, attention naturally shifts outward, not to act, but to notice, to see where it is now safe to exist without responding. That is where we go next, not deeper into the body, but into the lived space where the body has stopped needing to defend itself. Field case study, when nothing happens, and that's the point, the moment pressure ends, most people expect something to begin. Relief perhaps, clarity, a rush of feeling, a sense of arrival. Instead, what often arrives is nothing. This is where many people become confused. They have exited the relationship, left the workplace, survived the crisis, and stepped out of the environment that demanded constant adaptation. By all visible measures, the danger has passed, the external threat is gone, and yet internally there is no celebration. There is quiet, not peace, not joy, just quiet, and because quiet is rarely framed as a valid outcome, the mind immediately looks for an explanation. Why don't I feel better? Shouldn't something have shifted by now? Is something wrong with me? This is the field where stillness is most often misinterpreted, not as regulation, but as absence. Imagine someone who has lived for years under pressure. The pressure could be relational, institutional, ideological, financial, or emotional. It doesn't matter. What matters is that their nervous system has been organized around response, anticipation, monitoring, adjustment. Every day required some form of readiness. Then one day that structure ends. They leave, they step away, they survive. From the outside, this looks like freedom. From the inside, it feels like standing in a room after a loud machine has been switched off, ears ringing slightly, orientation delayed, the body unsure what to do with the silence. This is not numbness. This is decompression. The nervous system does not transition from threat to pleasure in a single step. It transitions from threat to neutrality first. And neutrality for a system accustomed to intensity can feel unsettling. There is often a subtle expectation that healing should announce itself, that there should be a noticeable improvement, a felt reward, a clear contrast between before and after. But biology does not operate on narrative timelines. The body measures safety not by events, but by duration without consequence. In this phase, the person may notice that their days feel oddly flat, not sad, not good, just unremarkable. Time may feel stretched, motivation is low, but not in a depressive way, more like a lack of urgency. Friends might ask, "How are you feeling now?" The honest answer would be, "I don't know." And that uncertainty can be deeply uncomfortable. We are conditioned to equate feeling with aliveness. But in this field, feeling has been overloaded for so long that the system has learned to associate intensity with threat. When intensity drops, the absence of stimulation does not immediately read as safety. It reads as missing input. The body is recalibrating its baseline. This recalibration takes place quietly. Nothing dramatic happens because nothing dramatic is required anymore. The person may wake up and notice there is no immediate spike of anxiety, no rush of checking, no scanning for danger. But instead of relief, there is a strange neutrality. They may sit longer without moving. They may stare into space without realizing it. They may forget to fill the silence with distraction, and then the mind intervenes. I should be doing something. I should be processing this. I should be feeling more. This should is not internal wisdom. It is residual field pressure, the echo of systems that required output, response, and explanation. Stillness does not satisfy those systems, which is why it can feel wrong. From the resonance matrix perspective, this is the first moment where the field truly loses its grip. There is no demand, no instruction, no feedback loop asking for compliance. The body finally has the space to notice that nothing bad is happening. This noticing is subtle. It does not register as insight. It registers as time passing without threat. Silence is not emptiness here. It is the absence of intrusion, and that distinction matters. Many people interpret this phase as losing themselves. In truth, the self is simply no longer being mobilized. Identity had been constructed around response, who I am when I react, comply, manage, and perform. When the reaction ends, identity goes quiet. This is not disappearance. It is a suspension. The body is catching up to survival ending. This phrase is essential. Survival does not end when danger ends. It ends when the body believes danger is no longer imminent. That belief is earned, not decided. In this field case, nothing happening is the signal. No conflict, no demand, no sudden need to act. Each uneventful hour tells the nervous system something new. I am not required right now. That message must be repeated many times before it is trusted, which is why stillness feels longer than expected. The person may attempt to reintroduce stimulation, scrolling, busyness, planning, analyzing, not because they want to, but because their system is unused to neutral ground. These attempts are not failures. They are reflexes. Over time, those reflexes lose urgency. The body stops reaching for distraction automatically. Moments of silence lengthen, and in those moments, something important happens, even though it looks like nothing. The nervous system reclaims authorship of time. Time is no longer structured by threat or anticipation. It becomes open, and openness, before it becomes liberating, often feels disorienting. This is why many people in this phase report a sense of waiting. Waiting for what? Not for something specific, just waiting. This waiting is not stagnation. It is integration. The nervous system is resynchronizing internal rhythms that were previously overridden by external pacing. Heart rate variability adjusts, hormonal baselines settle, muscle tone redistributes, cognitive load reduces. All of this occurs beneath awareness, which is why the experience feels anticlimactic. But anticlimax is precisely what safety feels like to a body that has known pressure. Nothing happening means nothing is required. Silence means no one is watching. Flatness means the nervous system is no longer amplifying signals to ensure survival. This is not the end state, it is the ground state. Stillness is not meant to be exciting. It is meant to be uneventful enough to be trusted. Only after that trust stabilizes does sensation return as information rather than threat. Only then can orientation emerge without urgency. Only then can discernment develop without hypervigilance. If this phase feels underwhelming, that is not a problem. It is evidence that the system is no longer being pulled by external force. Stillness does not announce itself with meaning. It announces itself by nothing needing to happen, and that is the point. In the next section, we will begin to explore what happens when this quiet ground becomes stable enough for the body to allow sensation to re-enter awareness, not as intensity, not as overwhelm, but as a signal returning carefully. For now, nothing happening is enough. The body is learning in real time that survival has ended, and that lesson does not need words. Language and stillness. When words fall away, there is a point in stillness where language begins to feel unnecessary. Not wrong, not forbidden, just slightly too heavy for the moment it would enter. This is unfamiliar territory for most people. We are trained to believe that language is what makes experience real, that naming something is what stabilizes it. That understanding arrives through articulation. But stillness reveals something quieter and more unsettling, that words often arrive after coherence, not before it. When the nervous system begins to thaw without movement, something else happens alongside the softening of muscle and breath. The internal narrative loosens. Sentences that once formed automatically begin to stall. The urge to explain fades, not because there is nothing to say, but because saying feels like an interruption. This is not dissociation. It is not avoidance. It is not suppression. It is the nervous system discovering that it does not need to narrate itself to exist. Within the resonance matrix, language has always been treated as a force, something that shapes physiology, perception, and orientation long before it conveys meaning. Volume 2 showed how language can invade, override, and commandeer the body. Volume 3 begins to reveal the inverse. What happens when the body no longer requires language to defend itself? Stillness is one of the few states where this becomes visible, because when the threat recedes, language no longer needs to perform vigilance. It no longer needs to justify, explain, persuade, or preempt misunderstanding. Words fall away not because expression is unsafe, but because silence finally is. This is where many people become uneasy. They notice that they have less to say and assume something is wrong. In a culture built on constant articulation, reduced speech is often interpreted as withdrawal. Quiet is mistaken for emptiness. Fewer words are seen as a loss of insight rather than a sign of integration. And so the mind tries to restart movement by talking, thinking, analyzing, naming. But stillness does not respond well to interruption. Naming too early can disrupt settling in the same way sudden movement can disrupt rest. The nervous system, having just learned that it does not need to act, is suddenly asked to perform coherence again. Language becomes a new task, meaning becomes something to manage, and so the body subtly tenses. This is why fewer words feel right here, not because words are dangerous, but because they are powerful. Language reorganizes the field. It pulls experience into structure. It draws edges around sensation. It invites response, interpretation, and alignment. In states of high threat, this is necessary. In states of recovery, it can be premature. The nervous system needs time to exist without being framed. Within the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this moment is crucial. Language normally mirrors the field back into the body, updating predictive models, reinforcing expectations, and shaping readiness. In stillness, the field is no longer issuing demands, and so the mirror does not need to reflect. The system is not disengaging from language. It is resting before language. This is the return of the ineffable gap, but not in the way it has appeared before. In earlier phases, the gap was something to be protected. A narrow space between stimulus and response that had to be defended against intrusion. A place of sovereignty that required vigilance, awareness, and effort. Here, the gap is no longer a defensive line. It is simply space, a space where nothing is being asked. A space where sensation does not need interpretation. Space where a response is not required. The gap has not widened. It has become irrelevant. Stillness restores the gap not by widening it, but by no longer needing to protect it. This is a profound shift, because protection implies threat, and stillness emerges when the threat has ended. In this state, language often feels slightly misaligned, like speaking too loudly in a quiet room. Not inappropriate, just unnecessary. People may notice that when they do speak, the words feel less performative, simpler, slower, more tentative, or they may notice they prefer not to speak at all. This can be unsettling for others. In relational fields accustomed to constant signaling, explanation, and reassurance, stillness can be misread as distance. Silence can be interpreted as withdrawal. Fewer words can provoke anxiety in those who rely on language to regulate connection. But the silence of stillness is not absence. It is presence without output. This distinction matters. Absence removes contact. Stillness holds contact without demand, and that is deeply unfamiliar in most social systems. Many people have never experienced being present without needing to manage perception, without needing to explain their internal state, without needing to maintain coherence through speech. So when stillness arrives, the mind often panics. Shouldn't I feel something? Shouldn't I understand this? Shouldn't I be making sense of it? These questions are not pathological. They are learned reflexes. They arise from years of living in environments where silence was unsafe, misunderstood, or punished, where not explaining meant being misread, where quiet meant withdrawal of connection, where words were necessary to stay oriented. Stillness asks something radical instead. It asks the system to trust that presence alone is sufficient. That trust does not arrive through instruction. It arrives over time. This is why naming too early disrupts settling. The body is not yet ready to be interpreted. It is still recalibrating to a world without pressure. Introducing language too soon pulls the system back into evaluation mode. What is this? Is this right? What does this mean? Those questions reactivate the very urgency that stillness is dissolving, and so the nervous system responds by tightening, again, not dramatically, just enough. Stillness does not demand silence. It invites restraint, a willingness to let experience remain unlabeled long enough to stabilize itself. This is not anti-language, it is pre-language, a phase before words resume their role, not as defense, not as justification, but as expression. From a mere linguistic hypothesis field theory perspective, this is where the relationship between language and environment resets. The body is no longer being mirrored by an external field that demands response. The internal field is quiet enough that mirroring can pause. This pause is rare. Most people have never experienced a field that does not require linguistic participation. Even alone, the internal monologue continues. Commentary fills the space. Analysis maintains movement. Stillness interrupts that pattern. Not forcefully, gently. Words fall away not because they are taken, but because they are no longer needed. This is where many spiritual traditions gesture, but often rush past. Silence is frequently framed as transcendence, enlightenment, or escape. Stillness is romanticized as a mystical attainment. But what is happening here is far more biological and far less glamorous. The nervous system is learning that it can exist without monitoring. No scanning, no rehearsing, no preparing, just being. Philosophically, this has been described as presence, being, or awareness. Culturally, it has been misunderstood as passivity. Psychologically, it is often misdiagnosed as numbness. But from within the resonance matrix, stillness is recognized as the earliest signal of restored safety. Safety, not as comfort, not as a pleasure, but as the absence of demand. Language becomes optional here, which is why forcing articulation can feel wrong. People often try to capture stillness to describe it, share it, and explain it. But stillness resists capture. The moment it is named, it begins to shift, not because naming destroys it, but because naming reintroduces orientation. Orientation comes later, stillness comes first. This is why the volume does not rush to sensation next. Sensation will return, but only once the body trusts that nothing is required of it, once words are no longer being used to secure safety. In this phase, silence is not emptiness. It is the body listening without needing to answer. The ineffable gap reappears here as spaciousness rather than vigilance. The gap is not a pause before reaction. It is an interval without expectation, a moment where stimulus does not automatically require a response. This is not something to hold on to. Trying to hold it collapses it. It is something to pass through. Language will return, but changed. When it does, it will no longer arrive as armor. It will arrive as a signal, but that belongs to later phases. For now, stillness is allowed to remain unspoken, and that in itself is the work. Observation practice, letting the present moment reassert itself. Observation, in this phase, is not something you do. It is something you stop interfering with. This distinction matters because most people arrive at observation already conditioned by effort. They try to observe correctly, calmly, productively. They monitor themselves by observing. They turn presence into another task to perform well. That impulse itself is a residue of survival. Stillness has already begun to dissolve urgency. Observation now allows the nervous system to confirm, again and again, that nothing bad happens when nothing happens. That confirmation is not cognitive, it is biological. The body learns safety through repetition, not insight. Observation is the simplest way to allow that repetition without adding demand. When a threat is active, the nervous system prioritizes prediction. It scans continuously for what might happen next. Attention is pulled forward into anticipation or backwards into rehearsal. The present moment becomes a thin corridor that the system rushes through on its way to somewhere safer. This is not anxiety as a personality. It is neuroception at work. Neuroception is the nervous system's automatic assessment of safety and danger. It operates below conscious awareness, evaluating tone, pace, posture, environment, relational cues, and internal state. When neuroception detects threat, even subtle, relational, or symbolic threat, it mobilizes readiness. Muscles hold, breath shortens, attention narrows, thought accelerates. Observation interrupts this without confrontation, not by a challenging threat, not by reassuring the mind, but by staying with what is already here, and this is where the paradox lies. The nervous system does not resolve threat by being told it is safe. It resolves the threat when prediction stops being necessary. Observation is the condition in which prediction is no longer rewarded. When you observe without trying to change anything, something quiet but profound happens in the brain. The predictive circuits, particularly those involving the anterior cingulate cortex and prefrontal monitoring systems, begin to downregulate. These regions are heavily involved in error detection, conflict monitoring, and something is off signaling. When nothing is being evaluated or corrected, these systems receive no new error signals. At the same time, sensory integration networks, particularly those involving the insula, are allowed to operate without being overridden. Interoception becomes less performative and more accurate. Sensation is no longer filtered through urgency or interpretation. This shift is subtle, but neuroplastic. The brain updates its models based on consequence. If attention remains in the present and nothing demands action, the model adjusts. Staying here is safe. That update is stored not as belief, but as expectation. This is how observation helps, not by calming the mind, but by retraining prediction. Many people worry that observation will make them passive, detached, or unresponsive. This fear usually comes from a lifetime of equating awareness with control. In survival contexts, awareness had to lead to action. Not acting meant danger. But observation in stillness is not about disengagement. It is about removing the obligation to respond. This matters for neuroplasticity because obligation keeps stress circuits active. Even gentle obligation, I should be noticing, I should be present, I should be calmer, keeps the system in low-grade mobilization. True observation has node. You notice because noticing happens. You remain because there is nowhere else you need to go. From a psychological perspective, this phase is often mislabeled as boredom, flatness, or emptiness. That mislabeling is itself a reflex of a system used for stimulation and resolution. In reality, what is happening is integration. After prolonged periods of threat, the nervous system often suppresses sensation to function. When the threat recedes, sensation does not immediately flood back as pleasure or clarity. It returns first as neutrality, as quiet, as nothing in particular. This is not an absence. It is recalibration. Observation allows that recalibration to complete without interference. Without observation, the mind often tries to improve the state by seeking stimulation, meaning, reassurance, or insight. Those efforts restart the movement prematurely. They pull the system back into doing. Observation allows the system to finish stopping. Within the resonance matrix framework, observation is also a field intervention. Volume 2 showed how fields override internal reference by saturating attention with urgency, language, reward, or threat. Observation withdraws attention from the field without confrontation. It does not resist influence. It simply stops feeding it. This matters because attention is the field's currency. When attention is not captured, entrained patterns lose coherence. Observation is not rebellion. It is disengagement, and disengagement is metabolically soothing. From a neurobiological standpoint, observation stabilizes the autonomic nervous system by allowing parasympathetic dominance to consolidate. But this consolidation does not feel dramatic. It does not arrive as bliss or insight. It arrives as ordinary. Breath deepens slightly without effort. Muscle tone reduces incrementally. Micromovements occur, size shifts, and swallowing. The system discharges without needing explanation. Observation allows these processes to occur uninterrupted. Trying to name them can interrupt them. This is why observation is framed here without instruction. No focus on the breath. No scan the body. No return to sensation. Those are actions. Observation allows sensation to be noticed if it is noticed, and ignored if it is not. Neuroception is particularly sensitive to choice pressure. When you feel you must observe correctly, the nervous system senses demand. That demand, however subtle, maintains vigilance. Observation only helps when it is genuinely optional. This is why the most effective observation often happens accidentally, when someone stares out a window, when they sit without checking their phone, when they pause between tasks. In those moments, the nervous system realizes, nothing is asking me to perform. This section formalizes that realization without formalizing the act. There is also an important memory component here. Under chronic stress, the hippocampus prioritizes threat-related memory encoding. Neutral moments are not stored as meaningful. Life becomes a sequence of pressures rather than a continuum of presence. Observation restores memory continuity. When attention rests in the present without evaluation, the brain begins encoding nothing happened as information. This matters more than it sounds. Nothing happening is nothing. It is safe. Repeated exposure to uneventful presence rebuilds the nervous system's tolerance for calm. It teaches the system that peace does not require explanation. This is foundational for the later phases of Volume 3 sensation, orientation, and discernment, because without tolerance for calm, signals cannot be trusted. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels significant. Discernment collapses into reaction. Observation prepares the ground. It is important to emphasize that observation here is not meant to feel good. If it does, fine. If it doesn't, also fine. The goal is not effect. It is familiarity. Familiarity with being here without demand. Over time, this familiarity rewires expectation. The nervous system stops scanning for the next task. The mind stops reaching for meaning. Space opens, not as insight, but as room. That room is where sensation will return later, unforced. From a psychological lens, observation also interrupts rumination without suppressing thought. Rumination persists when the mind believes it must solve something. Observation removes the premise that something must be solved right now. Thoughts may still arise, but without urgency, they lose traction. This reduces the emotional charge attached to thinking. Thoughts become events rather than directives. That shift is subtle but stabilizing. In the mirror linguistic hypothesis, observation represents a pause in linguistic mirroring. Language normally feeds back into the nervous system, shaping readiness and response. In observation, that loop loosens. Words arise more slowly. Internal narration thins. Silence becomes tolerable. This is not regression. It is reset. The mirror rests. Perhaps the most important thing to say about observation in this phase is this: it works even when it feels like nothing is happening, especially then. The nervous system does not announce recalibration. It completes it quietly. If you notice restlessness, that is an observation. If you notice boredom, that is observation. If you notice impatience, that is observation. Nothing needs to change. The only requirement, if it can be called that, is not leaving prematurely, not physically, but attentively. Observation is how the present moment reasserts itself, not dramatically, not forcefully, but persistently. It is how the body learns that time is no longer collapsing forward. That urgency is optional. That silence does not mean danger. This is not a technique to master. It is a condition to allow, and in allowing it, the nervous system begins to remember something it has not felt in a long time. That being here, without doing, without fixing, without naming, is not a threat. It is the beginning of the return. Self-reflection prompt, when nothing is required. This is not an exercise. It is not a task. It is not something to complete. It is a single invitation, offered without expectation. Take it slowly, or don't take it at all. Just let it exist alongside the stillness you've been noticing. One question only: what happens to me when there is nothing I need to do to stay safe? No answer is required. No insight is demanded. No journaling is needed. If a response comes, let it come. If nothing comes, let that be enough. This question is not meant to produce clarity. It is meant to reveal how quickly the nervous system looks for movement, and whether it can tolerate the absence of it. That noticing alone is sufficient. Nothing more is needed here. When the nervous system realizes that no response is required, something subtle occurs. Attention loosens. Muscle tone shifts. The internal scanning for threats begins to power down, and in that space, not as an answer, but as a condition, meaning is allowed to return on its own terms. What follows is not instruction. It is orientation. Integration. Stillness is the first signal. Stillness is not what comes after regulation. It is what makes regulation possible. We are often taught to treat stillness as an absence of action, of productivity, of relevance. Something passive, something inert, something that must eventually be replaced by movement, insight, or expression to be justified. But biologically, stillness is not an absence at all. It is the first signal of safety, before trust can form, before curiosity can return, before sensation can be felt without urgency, before meaning can arise without being forced. The nervous system cannot feel again while it is braced. It cannot listen while it is scanning. It cannot orient while it is preparing to move. Stillness is the moment the system receives permission to stop proving that it is alive. This is why for many people stillness feels unfamiliar or even unsettling, not because something is wrong, but because movement once kept them safe. Vigilance once prevented harm. Urgency once ensured survival. Action once substituted for stability. When those strategies are no longer required, the body does not immediately celebrate. It pauses. That pause is often misinterpreted. People describe it as flatness, as emptiness, as boredom, as a loss of direction. But what is actually happening is far more precise. The nervous system is recalibrating its baseline. For a long time, threat was the reference point. Now its absence must be learned. Stillness is the nervous system standing down from a war it has already survived. This is why Volume 3 begins here, not with insight, not with healing, not with agency, but with permission. Permission for breath to deepen without instruction. Permission for muscles to soften without collapse. Permission for awareness to exist without having to do anything with it. Stillness is not stagnation, it is thaw. Stillness is not weakness, it is the suspension of unnecessary defense. Stillness is not avoidance, it is contact without pressure, and until this signal is restored, every other signal remains distorted. Sensation cannot speak clearly if the body is still preparing to flee. Orientation cannot stabilize if attention is braced. Discernment cannot form if urgency is still running the system. Stillness is the ground from which the rest of the arc grows. It is the quiet moment when the body realizes it no longer has to outrun experience. Core line anchoring of Volume 3. You cannot feel again until you stop bracing against feeling. This is not the end of the journey. It is the return point. From here the arc moves forward, not into effort, but into sensation, not into performance, but into orientation, not into explanation, but into presence. Stillness is the first signal, everything else comes after. From stillness to return, what we have just encountered is not a conclusion. It is a pause that finally belongs to you. Episode 1 was never meant to explain anything away. It was not designed to give insight, meaning, or even relief in the conventional sense. Its purpose was quieter and far more fundamental, to interrupt the assumption that something must always be happening for you to be safe. Stillness, as you have heard it here, is not a technique. It is not an achievement. It is not the absence of life or direction. It is the moment the nervous system realizes it no longer needs to prove its worth through motion. In Volume 2, the arc moved through override, through pressure, through narrowing. Through extraction, the body was recruited, shaped, softened, confused, rewarded, and ultimately silenced. That descent followed a biological logic, not a moral one. Each word showed how agency is gradually displaced when the environment trains the nervous system to surrender its internal reference. Volume 3 does not reverse that story. It does not fight the field. It does not heal the past. It does not promise clarity on demand. Instead, it begins where override ends, with the moment after survival. Stillness is the first signal that the system is no longer bracing against a threat. It is the pause that arrives when vigilance no longer has an object. It is what remains when urgency dissolves, and nothing rushes in to replace it. That is why this episode may have felt sparse, why it may have felt slow, why it may have felt unfamiliar, flat, or even unsettling. Those reactions are not indicators of failure. They are indicators of thaw. The body does not re-enter sensation immediately after pressure ends. It waits. It listens. It tests the environment quietly. It confirms that nothing demands a response before allowing feeling to return. Stillness is that confirmation, and this is why Volume 3 follows the structure it does, not as a moral ascent, not as a spiritual ladder, not as a return to better versions of the self, but as a biological re-emergence, paced exactly as the nervous system recovers its capacity to orient from within. The arc ahead mirrors that recovery. After stillness, the next thing that returns is not insight. It is sensation, not a dramatic feeling, not an emotional narrative, but raw, unlabeled signal. In Episode 2, Sensation, the body begins to speak again, not in sentences, but in textures, impulses, and subtle shifts. Sensation does not arrive on schedule. It does not follow logic. It cannot be summoned. It emerges when the system feels safe enough to register experience, without immediately translating it into action. From there, the arc continues gently forward. Once sensation is present, the nervous system can begin orientation, locating itself in space, time, and relationship, knowing where it is, knowing when it is, knowing that now is not then. Only after orientation stabilizes can discernment form, the capacity to separate signal from noise without urgency or defense. Discernment allows boundary to return, not as aggression, but as edge, as the natural contour between self and other. The boundary creates the conditions for voice, expression that does not perform, persuade, or collapse into silence. Voice enables agency, a choice that is no longer driven by pressure or fear of consequence, but by internal alignment. From there, the arc moves outward. Agency makes reciprocity possible, mutual regulation instead of extraction. Reciprocity allows coherence, where inner and outer reality begin to align without force. And finally, the arc resolves in sovereignty, not dominance, not isolation, but presence without defense. The ability to remain oneself without bracing against the field. This is not the opposite of Volume 2. It is the biological answer to it. Volume 2 showed how the body is overridden when language, pressure, and environment collapse the internal reference point. Volume 3 shows how that reference returns, not through effort, but through permission. That return begins here. Stillness does not restore meaning. It restores capacity, and capacity is what allows sensation to return without overwhelming the system. So as this episode closes, there is nothing to integrate, nothing to apply, nothing to take with you. If nothing moved today, let that be enough. If nothing is resolved, let that be correct. If nothing becomes clear, trust that clarity is not the next requirement. The next movement is quieter. It does not announce itself. It does not ask for interpretation. It does not demand coherence. It arrives as sensation, unpredictable, unedited, and honest. In the next episode, we will not seek understanding. We will listen for the signal, not the signal of danger, but the signal of life returning to places that were once numb, muted, or rushed past. Episode 2, Sensation. When the body speaks again, thank you for entering this field of exploration. The matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once you begin to recognize it through feeling and self-awareness, perception becomes less confined by certainty and more guided by awareness. You've been listening to The Resonance Matrix, Volume 3, The Silencing Field, Return to Self, Episode 1, Stillness. After the nervous system, let's go. I'm James Miller.